One of my all-time favorite Haggadahs is the illustrated Haggadah from art schools for youth, for children. And it's a marvelous, marvelous Haggadah. And what I want to share with you today is the section on the order of the Seder. Now, the order of the Seder goes through the different steps of the Seder, and it shares with you like an overview of what we're going to cover tonight. And here's the different pieces. And so I want to go over that with you today, the different pieces of the steps of the Haggadah. So we begin with kadesh. Kadesh is when family comes home from the synagogue, from prayers, and the table is all set, and we're ready for to start the Passover Seder. So we make kiddush. And this is the first of what will be the 4 cups of wine that evening. So we make kiddush. And there's many blessings for the kiddush. There's the kiddush, there's shechionu for the season, but there's a lot of different parts to that one. The next step is urchatz. Urchatz means we wash our hands. Unlike when we wash our hands for bread and we make a blessing for the washing of the hands, this time we're washing our hands only for the concept of tuma and tahara, which usually translates as purity and impurity. Tuma is impurity, tahara is purity. That's not a good translation, but it's ritually appropriate or not. So one of the things that in the time of the temple, we would wash our hands before doing any of the special services to make sure that we were purified for the purposes of bringing a sacrifice or eating of the truma or eating of the sacrifices or different things. And so we wash our hands so we don't pass on this truma to anyone else. So there's different levels of tuma. There's the the highest level of tuma is the tumas hames, from having been involved in burying someone, and the tuma, the impurity that comes from having been involved in the funeral and touching the body and the coffin and being in the cemetery. That type of tuma forbids us from actually going on the Temple Mount and bringing sacrifices. Now, currently, we're not so on top of this because, of course, there's no temple, and so a lot of these things don't apply right now. But to some degree, they still do. Tumah can be transferred from one person to another by moisture, by water. So things that get dipped in water, for example, if one person dips in water and then another person comes, that second person now has a derivative tumah or impurity from the first person. We're about to dip a spring vegetable in salt water. And so it's important that everyone washes their hands right, left, pouring right water on the right hand 3 times, on the left hand 3 times. The idea of the washing is in preparation for dipping of food. Truthfully, anytime we would be dipping in a liquid all year long, we should be careful about that. And pickles is a big thing. If you're eating it with your fingers, if you're dipping in the water. But urchatz, this is washing our hands, no blessing yet. This is in preparation for the dipping of the spring vegetable. Karpas. Karpas is the next stage, and karpas is dipping a spring vegetable in salt water. The karpas itself, some people will use a tzibula, an onion. Some people use a kartoffel, a little piece of potato. Others will use parsley. But the idea is a spring vegetable to remind us that in God's grace, He took us out of Egypt in the month of the spring, not in the cold winter, not in the hot summer, not in the chilly fall, but in the springtime when it's just getting fresh and warm. And so it's a great kindness that God did for us. We always want to remember that God brought us out in the month of the spring. And we take a spring vegetable, we dip it in salt water. Salt water is to remind us of the tears of the slavery in our times in Egypt. And this whole evening long of Passover, we're going to go back and forth between the ideas of freedom and the ideas of slavery, the ideas of celebration and being like royalty and reclining and everything else. On the other side, we'll talk about the slavery and the bitter times, and we'll go back and forth this evening between all those 2 different sides of things. When we talk about the idea of the Passover is in the month of the spring, that Passover happens, that God took us out of Egypt in the month of the spring, it's interesting to compare the 2 calendars. There's a lunar calendar and there's a solar calendar. The largest population of the world goes by a solar calendar. but there's a large population that goes by the lunar calendar as well. Jews and have the Muslims also go by a lunar calendar, and so your holidays follow the lunar dates. We have Hebrew names for the Hebrew months and things. Interestingly enough, the Muslim calendar, their holidays rotate around the solar calendar because there's no adjustment for it. But the Jewish calendar, we have to adjust our lunar calendar for the solar calendar because Passover has to come in the springtime. So every couple of years, we'll throw in an extra month of Adar. Adar Rishon, Adar Shena, the first month of Adar, the second month of Adar. The second Adar is thrown in periodically in order to readjust our calendar so that our lunar calendar still brings out Passover to fall in the month of the spring every year. So our calendar has to adjust our lunar to our solar so that Passover can happen in the springtime. Next step is Yachatz. I did a little video about matzah. You may want to check that one out as well. But the idea here is there are 3 matzahs on the Seder plate. 2 of them represent the 2 loaves, the 2 whole loaves that we have for any Jewish holiday. For Shabbos or for a holiday of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah, Shavuos, Passover, we also have 2 breads, but these are matzah breads. So we have 2 whole matzahs, but there's a third matzah, which it happens to be in the middle between the 2. The third matzah is called the poor man's bread. And a poor man, since he doesn't know what tomorrow is going to bring, he'll break his loaf of bread and save part of it for another time. So too, the Yachatz is we break that middle matzah and we put part of it away as a poor man's bread for the future. In our circumstance, we're going to save that bread for the Afikomen, but that's another story. Magid. We tell the story of Passover. Magid is the longest part of the Haggadah, and it covers as many details as we can possibly think of to appreciate and acknowledge how grateful we are to all the amazing things that God did for us. So in this part, we'll talk about the Manishtana, the 4 questions. We'll talk about the rabbis that sat in Bnei Brak and shared stories all night long about the miracles of going out of Egypt. We'll talk about the plagues. All of the story part happens here in the part about Magid. Towards the end of Magid, we now start preparing for the meal. Rachza means we go and wash our hands again, but this time we will make a blessing because this time we're washing our hands for the breaking of bread, for having to eat the bread, which in this case, of course, is matzah. Motzi matzah, the stage called Motzi matzah, is called Motzi matzah because there's 2 blessings we make over the matzahs. We make Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, the blessing that we make anytime we're eating bread. But here we also make a blessing al achilas matzah on the fact that God commanded us to eat the matzah itself. So there's 2 blessings we make on the motzi matzah, and then we will eat a kazayas, at least a certain amount of bread of the matzah, to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. Maror. Maror is when we eat the bitter herbs, and the bitter herbs are there to remind us of the slavery in Egypt. So we'll take some of the bitter herbs, we'll dip them in the charosis, but then we'll shake that off so we don't want to mix the bitter and the sweet at the same time. And we'll make a blessing for the eating of the maror, and we'll eat up the maror. And again, we want to eat a certain amount of the maror to fulfill the mitzvah, and we eat it within a certain time frame, and we finish off the maror. Koirech. This Seder step called koirech is when we eat the matzah and the maror together. This is in commemoration of the idea that there's some folks, some of the rabbis say we have to eat matzah and maror and the korban pesach, the paschal lamb, together. There are those that say we eat it separately. We had matzah, we had maror, and we would later eat the korban pesach, the paschal lamb. We would eat that as the last thing we eat in the Seder because we want the taste to linger. But there are those opinions that say we have to eat matzah and maror and the korban pesach together at the same time. We don't have the temple right now when I'm making this recording. Maybe by this evening we will. But when we when we go by Hillel's opinion that we eat the matzah and the maror and the korban pesach together, you would make a sandwich of the matzah and the maror and the paschal lamb and eat them together. At this point, we just say, just like Hillel says, we eat the matzah and the maror together, yachad, together at the same time, and this is called koirech. Now that we've had our first cup of wine, our second cup of wine, we've had our matzah, we've had our maror, we've had our koirech together. Now we have the Shulchan Aruch. Now we sit down and we have the meal together and continue to share some of the extra stories about all the things, the great miracles that God did for us during Passover. After the meal is over, the last taste we want to have in our mouth is the korban pesach, the paschal lamb. And because at this moment we don't have the temple in which we can offer the paschal lamb and therefore eat the paschal lamb, so instead we eat the leftover half of that middle matzah that we broke earlier. It's called the afikomen. The afikomen really means dessert, and the dessert should be the paschal lamb. But since we can't have that now, so we're eating the matzah as the afikomen, and the last taste will be of the meal will be that afikomen that we eat at the end of the meal. As soon as we finally finish the meal, we're going to say the blessing after the meal. And as Beirach is the step where we say the last blessing after the meal, which is the traditional blessing with some additional parts to it. And we finish off the blessing after the meal with another cup of wine, a third cup of wine. This cup of wine, again, is celebrating the fact the Passover example, but also the idea that we finished off the benching, the Birchat HaMazon. After the benching, we say Hallel, lots of praises of thanking God for all the wonderful miracles He's done for us. And after that last Hallel, our last cup of wine, and we then Nirtzah, we pray that God will accept all of our efforts to celebrate the Passover together and next year in Jerusalem. I hope this is helpful as you prepare for your own Passover Seder. Take care. God bless.